PitchSnapshot, improving pitch memory. In order to make use of the possibility of training the ability of pitch memory, we will argue in the following: in a completely logical way, in the spirit of common sense. It is not claimed here that this method is scientifically founded, or that users of the method will acquire absolute pitch. Nevertheless, everyone will understand how, based on logical reasoning, if not to say deduction, this method, when practiced conscientiously, consistently leads to an improvement of pitch memory. The first assumption, which must appear entirely self-evident and almost innate to every human being, is that every form of memory can be traced back to a reality. Reality is a manifest vibration, since, as is well known, everything is vibration, whether we are dealing with objects, particles, waves, memories, etc. If it is a matter of human memory of a reality, then this vibration must therefore be represented in some form in the mind, even if with certain limitations. Let us take an apple or a ceramic wash basin as an example. When we think of these objects, we can bring them to life in memory by means of color, shape, perceived temperature, surface texture, hardness, and even imagined sound. Of course, not in their so-called physical form, but in a form constructed by us in the mind, that is, in the way we are able to perceive the external physical form. We are therefore speaking of a representation. By this, every aspect of mental representation is meant, not only the visual one. This leads directly to the second assumption. In order to retain something in memory for a longer or sustained period of time, it must first succeed for a shorter period in mentally grasping what is to be remembered, so that it can be maintained for longer. Let us repeat: mentally grasping what is to be remembered. If what is to be remembered is not a construct of our own consciousness, but something physically external, then it must be capable of being represented in a concrete, exclusive, or distinguishable form. Now, in medias res directly to pitch memory, a tone sounding externally has more than the abstract properties of frequency and amplitude, not unlike the apple or the wash basin. This is precisely the first hurdle we must overcome in developing an increasingly long-lasting pitch memory, the representation of the external tonal phenomenon. The faster we succeed in creating a concrete mental representation of the external appearance, the better our ability to distinguish the nature of the represented categories will function, in this case, pitch. Anyone who has ever taken a drawing course in realistic drawing from nature will be familiar with this principle, which we can justifiably call pitch snapshot here. When drawing from life, one virtually photographs the model with the eyes, that is, with the visual sense, in order to transfer it from the image of mental representation onto paper. Here one can experience that at first the visual photograph immediately disappears from consciousness, and one must repeatedly look back at the model one wishes to draw. Experienced artists, however, are able to retain objects in memory for much longer. The initial exercises for pitch snapshot will therefore aim at training the mental representation of sounding tones. Someone might now say that this has nothing to do with pitch memory, because there are still other aspects involved. In fact, It soon becomes evident that this exercise very much does affect pitch memory, even though timbre and other sound characteristics are also involved. Here, too, it is entirely sufficient as proof to consider the matter logically. If I succeed in forming a concrete mental representation of a sounding event, then the property of pitch is also contained within it. For the representation is only correct if I am able to reconstruct all aspects of what is sounding as I perceive it in the mind. Empirically, anyone who practices this successfully for a while will be able to confirm exactly this. Thus, in summary, the following can be derived. In order to develop memory for tones, they must first be represented in the mind in a completely realistic way, because without this representation, no extension of memory can take place, since there is nothing present whose duration could be extended. In order to represent something, it must first be presented to perception. The primary channel of our consciousness for tones is, as any even moderately musical person will immediately understand, auditory perception, our sense of hearing. We therefore do not wish to go into the other undoubtedly existing possibilities and aspects of tonal experience here, such as gut feeling, haptics, etc. Our hearing, that is, the interaction of ear, brain, and consciousness, is already equipped with a multidimensional encoding of what is sounding, so that we can experience rich representations within ourselves and thus reproduce them. In addition to pitch, also chroma, there are several other properties, such as space, also location, height and depth, also register, timbre, microtemporal development, loudness, etc. However, it is not necessary to think about tones in an analytical way, because this leads to a premature interpretation of sound events, and this is often precisely what destroys the pathway from perception to representation. Instead, we need an intention-free listening, best truly described by the construct PitchSnapshot. At the moment the sound event occurs, we listen and represent it. We photograph the situation as it presents itself to us, in its entirety, including pitch, spatial information, and background noise, without interpretation or judgment of what is heard. That is to say, the exercises are designed in such a way that there is a presentation duration during which the object is presented to us, and a silence phase equals pause, in which we attempt to reconstruct in the representation in the mind. The task is therefore to listen, to represent, and to let it sound within oneself. This is best practiced by repeating the same process with different source material, in our case, tones, sounds, etc. In order to benefit substantially from this type of exercise, we refrain from intentional interpretation of what is heard and focus exclusively on the process of representation and reconstruction. From the outside, we appear simply quiet listening. Internally, however, we are constantly engaged in listening and letting what was heard sound again during the presentation pause. If interpretative associations arise, this is neither harmful nor unusual. The important point is simply that in these exercises, interpretation is not the goal, but representation. Interpretation is not what is meant to be trained here. Unfortunately, Many conventional ear training methods are caught up in an obsession with interpreting what is heard. As a result, the ability to truly listen is often not trained at all in ear training. The outcome is primarily the ordering and verbalization of what one already knows, which is fundamentally not a bad thing and certainly a valuable cultivation of skills. However, without training perception itself, one will never surpass a certain threshold of musically usable listening ability.